The quiet suburb of Lyon, usually filled with the sounds of everyday life, was awakened on this Sunday morning by a piercing scream. Rue de la Rose, known for its elegant houses and manicured gardens, was suddenly the center of an event that would change the lives of its inhabitants forever. The source of the commotion was Claire Dubois, the Moreau family's housekeeper. The woman ran out of the house number 23, her face contorted with terror and her hands trembling. The neighbors, attracted by the unusual noise for their quiet street, began to look out of their windows and into the street. Claire, unable to utter a word, merely pointed with a shaking hand to the second floor of the house. The police arrived on the scene within minutes. Detective Luc Bernard, an experienced investigator with a discerning eye and a reputation for solving the most intricate cases, was the first to arrive. After glancing around the crowd of onlookers, he went straight to the trembling Claire. Under the detective's soothing gaze, Claire was finally able to squeeze out a few words. She explained that she had come to clean the house as usual and had found the owner, Sophie Moreau, lying motionless in the bedroom. Bernard nodded and, leaving Claire in the care of the paramedics, went into the house. After going up to the second floor, the detective found himself in a spacious bedroom. Here he was, greeted by a picture that even he, who had seen a lot in his career, stopped for a moment. On the wide bed lay Sophie Moreau, a young woman in her 30s. Her long, dark hair was strewn across the pillow, and her neck showed signs of strangulation. The detective's gaze slid around the room, noting every detail. On the bedside table stood an unfinished glass of red wine. Next to it lay an open book, James Ellroy's novel, The Black Orchid. Bernard noted to himself the irony of his choice of literature. The light scent of expensive perfume still lingered in the air. The room looked untouched, no signs of struggle or forced entry. This suggested that Sophie probably knew her killer and had willingly let him into the house. On the dressing table, the detective noticed several framed photographs. One of them showed Sophie standing next to a middle-aged man and a young man, apparently her husband and son. Bernard continued his inspection, paying attention to every little detail. In the wastepaper basket, he found several crumpled sheets of paper. Unfolding one of them, the detective saw the beginning of a letter written in a trembling hand. It began, "Dear F, I can no longer keep our secret." The rest of the letter was furiously crossed out. Meanwhile, a forensic team arrived at the house. They methodically began examining every inch of the room, looking for fingerprints, hair, fibers, any evidence that might shed light on the killer's identity. Stepping out onto the balcony, Bernard glanced around the street. A small crowd of curious people had already gathered below. He knew that news of the murder would spread quickly through the city, and soon he would have to deal not only with the investigation, but also with a press hungry for sensationalism. Back in the room, the detective turned his attention to the laptop on the desk. It was on, and Sophie's mailbox was open on the screen. The last email he had received had caught Bernard's attention. It was from someone named F, and contained just one line. "We need to talk, tonight, as usual." Having finished his initial examination of the crime scene, Bernard left the house. He knew he had a long and complicated investigation ahead of him. He had to interview Sophie's husband and son, who neighbors said had gone away for the weekend, check surveillance cameras in the neighborhood, and delve into the victim's life to see who might have wanted her dead. As he descended the stairs, the detective mentally made a prioritized list of actions. It was necessary to organize a full inspection of the house and the surrounding area, interview the neighbors, contact Sophie's family, and start compiling a list of possible suspects. Of particular interest was the mysterious F mentioned in the letter and email. Stepping outside, Bernard took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. The sun had already risen high, flooding De La Rose Street with bright light. This beautiful Sunday afternoon was in stark contrast to the grim crime that had taken place behind the closed doors of one of the houses. The detective knew this case would not be an easy one. He had seen many violent crimes in his long career, but something about Sophie Moreau's death made him feel that this investigation would be special. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind this murder than met the eye. With these thoughts in mind, Luc Bernard headed for his car. On the way to his car, the detective noticed an elderly woman watching the scene from the window of a neighboring house. Their eyes met, and Bernard realized that this woman might know more than meets the eye. He made a mental note to begin his canvass of the neighbors with her. Getting into the car, Bernard took another look at the crime scene. The Moreau family home, yesterday a model of prosperity, now held a dark secret. The detective sensed that behind the facade of this respectable suburb lay secrets that could shake the foundations of society. Detective Luc Bernard sat in his office studying the crime scene photos. It had been 2 days since Sophie Moreau's body had been discovered, and he now had files on the 4 main suspects in front of him. Each of them had different motives and possibilities for the murder, and Bernard's task was to unravel this tangle of lies and secrets. First on the list was Philippe Moreau, the victim's husband. The 52-year-old successful businessman looked flawless in the dossier photo. His graying temples and shrewd gaze gave him the appearance of a man accustomed to being in control. However, Bernard knew that behind this facade there could be dark secrets. During the first interrogation, Philippe held himself confidently, showing deep grief at the loss of his wife. He claimed to have been at a business meeting in Paris on the night of the murder. The alibi seemed solid, but the detective noticed Philippe nervously rubbing his wedding ring during the conversation. Something in his demeanor made Bernard doubt the man's sincerity. Next on the list was Alexandre Moreau, the 25-year-old son of Sophie and Philippe. The young man with disheveled dark hair and a strained look looked distressed during the interrogation. He claimed to have spent the night at the home of his girlfriend Clara Dupont. However, his alibi had gaps. Clara's neighbors claimed to have heard the front door slam late at night. Bernard noted Alexandre's strange reaction to some questions about his relationship with his mother. The young man was visibly tense when it came to the last weeks before the murder. Had something changed in their relationship? The detective sensed that Alexander was understating things, withholding some important information. The third suspect was Clara Dupont, Alexander's girlfriend. The 22-year-old art student seemed the epitome of innocence with her big brown eyes and soft smile. However, Bernard knew that appearances could be deceiving. During the interrogation, Clara was nervous, constantly tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She confirmed Alexander's alibi, but there were inconsistencies in her story. The detective noticed a strange detail. There was a barely visible bruise on Clara's wrist, which she tried to hide with the sleeve of her sweater. When Bernard asked about it, the girl turned visibly pale and mumbled something about an unfortunate fall. Was it really an accident, or a sign of the darker side of her relationship with Alexander? Last on the list of suspects was François Lemaire, Philippe's business colleague. A 45-year-old man with a groomed appearance and a charming smile, he gave the impression of a man used to getting what he wanted. During the interrogation, François had been confident, even too confident in Bernard's opinion. Lemaire claimed to have worked late at the office on the night of the murder, but security cameras showed that he had left the building an hour before the estimated time of Sophie's death. When the detective pointed out the discrepancy, François only shrugged, saying that he must have gotten the time wrong because of the stress of the past few days. Bernard noticed François unconsciously rubbing the ring finger of his left hand, where the white stain of a recently removed ring was visible. Was it a sign of a recent divorce or an attempt to hide his marital status? Studying the dossier, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that all 4 suspects were hiding something. Each of them had the opportunity to commit murder, and each seemed to have a different motive. Philippe Moreau could have killed his wife out of jealousy or to cover up financial fraud in his business. Alexandre could have committed the crime in a fit of anger, perhaps after learning some shocking secret about his mother. Clara could have acted out of jealousy or to protect Alexandre, and François Lemaire could have been involved in business intrigue or had personal motives related to Sophie. Bernard leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples. He knew there were dark secrets lurking behind this family's facade of respectability. He would have to delve deeper into the lives of these people to find the thread that would lead him to the killer. The detective thought of the mysterious F mentioned in the letter and email found in Sophie's room. Could it have been an abbreviation for François, or was it someone else, as yet unknown to the investigation? Bernard decided that the next step would be to look more closely at the financial records of Philippe and his company. Perhaps there was a clue lurking there. He also planned to re-interview Alexander and Clara to clarify the inconsistencies in their statements. The detective also hadn't forgotten about the elderly neighbor he'd noticed the day the body was discovered. Her look suggested that she might have witnessed something important. Bernard decided he would pay her a visit soon to see what she might have seen or heard the night of the murder. Looking at the photos of the suspects spread out in front of him, Luc Bernard felt that this case was going to be one of the most challenging of his career. Not only would it test his professional skills, but it would also make him think about the nature of human relationships and how far people were willing to go to keep their secrets. With a heavy sigh, the detective closed the file folder. He knew that sleepless nights, hours of interrogation, and painstaking work lay ahead of him. But Bernard was ready for the challenge. He was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how unpalatable it turned out to be. Turning off the lights in his office, the detective headed for the exit of the police station. Tomorrow he had a long day ahead of him, filled with more questioning and searching for clues. And somewhere out there, amidst the lies and innuendo, hid the truth about who had cut Sophie Moreau's life short and why. A week later, the first thing Bernard turned to the past of Philippe Moreau. At first glance, the successful businessman led an impeccable life. However, digging deeper, the detective discovered disturbing facts. It turned out that over the past year, Philippe's company faced serious financial difficulties. Several risky investments had led to significant losses, and now the business was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Even more interesting was the fact that shortly before her death, Sophie had withdrawn a large sum from her personal account. Bernard wondered if she might have learned of her husband's financial problems and decided to walk away, taking her money. Or perhaps Philippe had tried to persuade his wife to invest in his business, and her refusal had led to a fatal conflict. The detective also paid attention to the history of Philippe and Sophie's relationship. Outwardly, they seemed to be an ideal couple, but the testimonies of close friends painted a different picture. In recent months, there had been frequent quarrels between the couple, and some had even mentioned the possibility of divorce. What was behind these conflicts? Bernard felt that the answer to this question might be the key to unraveling the whole affair. Shifting his attention to Alexandre Moreau, the detective was faced with an equally complicated story. The young man had always been a model son and a successful student, but about a year ago, there was a drastic change in his behavior. He began to skip classes at the university. His academic performance dropped dramatically. Alexander was arrested several times for minor offenses involving alcohol and bar fights. Bernard wondered about the reasons for such a transformation. What could have had such an effect on the young man? The detective recalled the tension he had noticed between Alexander and his father during the interrogations. Perhaps the root of the problem lay in family relations? Of particular interest was the information about Alexander's recent trip to Paris. According to the official version, he traveled to a conference related to his studies. However, Bernard discovered that at the same time in Paris, there was a closed auction of art objects. Given Clara's interest in art, the detective couldn't help but wonder if the trip was connected to something more serious than a simple conference. Speaking of Clara Dupont, Bernard discovered that behind the facade of the pretty student lurked a complex personality. Growing up in a dysfunctional family, Clara learned early on to rely on herself. Her passion for art led her to a prestigious university, where she met Alexander. However, the detective noticed a strange detail. Shortly before Sophie's murder, Clara suddenly dropped out of school, despite her excellent grades and the prospect of a brilliant career. What could have made the ambitious girl give up her dream? Bernard suspected that there was more behind this decision than just a desire to focus on her relationship with Alexander. Even more intriguing was the revelation about Clara's past. The investigation revealed that several years ago, she had been involved in an art forgery scandal. The case was hushed up thanks to the intervention of influential people, but the fact itself made one wonder about the true talents and ambitions of this young woman. Finally, Bernard turned to the study of the past of François Lemaire. At first glance, Philippe's successful business partner seemed to be a man with an impeccable reputation. However, digging deeper, the detective discovered a number of disturbing facts. It turned out that over the past year, François had met with Sophie alone several times. Officially, these meetings were to discuss a charity project his partner's wife was involved in, but the length and frequency of these meetings made one wonder about the possibility of a more personal relationship. Bernard also discovered that shortly before Sophie's death, Francois had unexpectedly filed for divorce from his wife. The process had been quick and quiet, without too much publicity. Could this fact be related to his relationship with Sophie? And how could Philippe react to it, having learned about his wife's possible infidelity with his best friend? Another detail caught the detective's attention. On the night of the murder, Francois, according to him, was working late at the office. However, security cameras recorded him leaving the building an hour before Sophie's estimated time of death. Where did he go? And why did he lie about it during the first interrogation? Diving deeper and deeper into the suspect's past, Bernard could feel the many threads weaving together in a complex pattern. Each had ulterior motives. Each could have been involved in Sophie Moreau's death. The detective leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples. He realized that behind every fact, every detail, there could be a clue to the crime. But how to connect all these disparate pieces into a coherent picture? Bernard remembered the mysterious F mentioned in Sophie's letter and email. Now aware of the meetings with Francois, the detective couldn't help but wonder, was it him? And if so, what secret was the unfinished letter referring to? Closing the case files, Luc Bernard felt that he was on the verge of an important discovery. He knew that somewhere among this maze of lies, secrets, and ulterior motives lurked the truth about Sophie Moreau's death, and he was determined to find it, no matter how unpalatable it turned out to be. The detective realized that the next step would be a new round of interrogations. Now, armed with this information, he could ask more precise questions, catching suspects at inconsistencies in their stories. Bernard also decided that the financial records of Philippe and Francois' company should be examined more closely. They might hold the key to unraveling the motive for the murder. In addition, he planned to meet with some of Sophie's friends to get a fuller picture of her life in the final weeks before her death. The investigation into Sophie Moreau's murder took an unexpected turn in the early hours of Tuesday morning. Detective Luc Bernard had just started his first coffee when an agitated young officer literally burst into his office. In a broken whisper, he reported an anonymous call he had received at the station a few minutes ago. Bernard was instantly alert. The anonymous call could mean a breakthrough in the case or another dead end. He listened carefully to the recording of the conversation. An unknown male voice, distorted beyond recognition, claimed to have seen a middle-aged man leaving Sophie Moreau's house on the night of the murder. The description was vague, but one detail caught the detective's attention. The stranger limped on his left leg. This information made Bernard reconsider his assumptions. None of the prime suspects had any trouble walking. Who could this mysterious visitor be? And why had the witness decided to talk only now? The detective decided to take another thorough look at the crime scene. Perhaps they had missed something the first time around. Arriving at Moreau's house, Bernard began to methodically explore each room, paying attention to the smallest details. In Sophie's bedroom, a barely noticeable scratch on the parquet under the bed caught his attention. His intuition told him it was for a reason. Bernard knelt down and, illuminating the space under the bed with a flashlight, discovered a small hiding place. Inside lay a tattered leather-bound notebook. With a beating heart, the detective opened it. It was Sophie's personal diary. Bernard began to read, and with each page his eyebrows rose higher and higher. The entries revealed a whole new side of the murdered woman's life. The diary was full of hints of a secret affair. Sophie wrote about meetings with a man she referred to only by the initial F. Their relationship had apparently begun about a year ago and had quickly developed into more than just friendship. Bernard frantically flipped through the pages, trying to find a clue to the identity of the mysterious F. Could it have been Francois Lemaire, Philippe's business partner, or someone else as yet unknown to the investigation? The last entry in the diary was dated the day of the murder. Sophie wrote about her decision to end her relationship with F and tell the truth to her husband. She mentioned some important conversation that was to take place in the evening. Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. Perhaps it was this conversation that had caused her death. Leaving the house with the diary safely packed in an evidence bag, the detective noticed an elderly woman watering flowers in a neighbor's yard. It was the same neighbor he had noticed the day the body was discovered. Deciding that now would be a good time to talk to her, Bernard headed toward her house. Madame Dubois, as the woman introduced herself, was an observant and talkative person. She said that on the night of the murder, she could not sleep because of the heat and sat at an open window. Around midnight, she noticed a man coming out of Moreau's house. In the darkness, she could not see his face, but she noticed his characteristic gait. He limped slightly. This information confirmed the anonymous caller's words and made her wonder about the new suspect. Bernard thanked Madame Dubois and returned to the station, feeling that the investigation had reached a new level. In his office, the detective immersed himself in the study of Sophie's diary. Between the lines of love confessions and descriptions of secret meetings, he found references to some project F was working on. Sophie had written about her doubts and fears about this project, but had not gone into detail. Bernard wondered, could it be related to the financial difficulties of Philippe's company? Or was it about something more serious, perhaps even illegal? The detective decided to re-interview all the suspects armed with new information. He started with Philippe Moreau, hoping to catch him off guard with questions about his wife's possible infidelity. Philippe's reaction was unexpected. Instead of anger or surprise, he seemed rather relieved. It made Bernard wonder, did Philippe know about his wife's infidelity? And if so, why hadn't he done anything about it? Alexander's interrogation came next. The young man was visibly nervous when the detective mentioned his mother's secret affair. He admitted that he suspected the existence of another man in Sophie's life, but didn't know who it could have been. Clara Dupont held herself confidently during the interrogation, but Bernard noticed her flinch at the mention of the project. The girl claimed to know nothing about it, but the detective sensed that she was hiding something. The interrogation of François Lemaire proved most intriguing. When Bernard asked him directly if he was the F from Sophie's diary, François turned pale. He denied any romantic involvement with his partner's wife, but his nervousness said otherwise. After a series of interrogations, Bernard felt he was closer to a clue, but the key element still eluded him. Who was the limping man who had left Sophie's house on the night of the murder, and what did it have to do with the mysterious project? That same evening, the detective was in for another surprise. The analysis of the fingerprints on Sophie's diary yielded an unexpected result. In addition to Sophie's own prints, there were traces on the pages belonging to Clara Dupont. This discovery forced Bernard to reconsider Clara's role in the story. How did Sophie's diary end up in the hands of her son's girlfriend, and what could she have learned from it? The detective decided it was time for a tougher talk with Clara. He sent an officer to bring the girl to the station, but he returned empty-handed. Clara had disappeared, leaving a note for Alexander saying that she had to leave urgently for a family matter. This sudden disappearance only heightened Bernard's suspicions. He ordered a search for Clara and stepped up surveillance of the other suspects. At night, as the detective was about to go home, he received a call from the lab. The experts had found microscopic traces of a rare type of paint used in art restoration on the cover of Sophie's diary. This detail brought Clara's past and her connection to the art world back into focus. Bernard felt that all the threads of this tangled case were beginning to come together. He was certain that the key to solving Sophie Moreau's murder lay somewhere at the intersection of her secret affair, her mysterious project, and her unexpected connection to the art world. As the detective fell asleep that night, he knew that tomorrow would be his most important day in the investigation. He was determined to solve all the mysteries, no matter how shocking the truth might turn out to be. Detective Luc Bernard sat in the cool interrogation room preparing for a series of intense interviews with the suspects. New evidence and information gleaned from Sophie's diary demanded a revision of earlier statements. Bernard felt that today he would be able to break through the wall of silence and lies surrounding the case. The first person called in for questioning was Philippe Moreau. The victim's husband entered the room with the look of a man carrying a heavy burden. His once immaculate suit looked wrinkled, and his eyes were surrounded by dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights. Bernard began by asking questions about Philippe's alibi on the night of the murder. Moreau repeated his original version. He was on a business meeting in Paris, returned late at night, and discovered his wife's body the next morning. However, when the detective presented evidence that the meeting had ended earlier than the stated time, Philippe visibly tensed up. After several minutes of pressure, Moreau reluctantly admitted that he had lied about the time of his return. In fact, he had arrived home around 11 p.m., but had not gone into the bedroom, deciding to spend the night in the guest room so as not to disturb his wife. This confession opened up new questions. Why did Philip lie initially, and what was really going on in the house that night? Clara Dupont, Alexandra's girlfriend, was called in for questioning next. Her sudden disappearance and subsequent return was of particular interest to the detective. Clara looked pale and tense, her eyes running restlessly around the room. Bernard began by asking her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Clara confirmed her initial statement that she had been at home with Alexander. However, when the detective mentioned the testimony of neighbors who had heard the front door slam late at night, the girl became visibly nervous. After a long silence, Clara admitted that she had lied. In fact, she left the apartment around midnight after a quarrel with Alexander. According to her, she was just walking around the night city trying to calm down. But why did she hide this fact earlier? And where was Clara really going that night? Bernard was particularly interested in the interrogation of Alexandra Moreau. The victim's son looked exhausted and depressed. When the detective asked him about the night of the murder, Alexandra repeated his version that he had spent the evening at home with Clara. However, faced with the contradictions in his girlfriend's testimony, the young man became visibly confused. Under pressure from Bernard, Alexander finally admitted that he had lied about his alibi. In fact, after the quarrel with Clara, he too had left the apartment. Alexander claimed that he had gone to a friend's house to have a drink and calm down. But why had he hidden it before? And could he have gone to his mother's house instead? The last person called in for questioning was François Lemaire. Philippe's business partner held himself confidently, but Bernard noticed him nervously rubbing the cufflink on his sleeve. The detective began by asking him about his relationship with Sophie Moreau. François denied having a romantic connection with his partner's wife, insisting that their relationship was purely business. However, when Bernard mentioned the frequent meetings in private and mysterious entries in Sophie's diary, Lemaire's confidence shaken. After a long silence, François admitted that there had indeed been an affair between him and Sophie, but he insisted that it was only platonic. They discussed some kind of project, the details of which Lemaire refused to disclose, citing commercial confidentiality. François' alibi for the night of the murder also raised questions. He claimed to have worked late at the office, but surveillance cameras showed that he had left the building an hour before the estimated time of Sophie's death. When Bernard pointed out this discrepancy, Lemaire became nervous and admitted that he had met Sophie that night, but insisted that he had parted from her alive and unharmed. As the interrogations continued, Bernard sensed that each of the suspects was hiding something. Their statements were full of contradictions and ambiguities. The detective realized that the key to solving Sophie Moreau's murder lay somewhere in this tangle of lies and secrets. Bernard's special attention was drawn to the unexpected connection between Clara and the art world. The traces of restoration paint on Sophie's diary and Clara's background in art forgery made him wonder about a possible connection between the murder and some kind of art crime. The detective also couldn't get rid of the thought of the mysterious limping man spotted by the neighbor on the night of the murder. Who could it be? And how was he connected to the other suspects? After a grueling day of questioning, Bernard returned to his office to analyze the information he had received. He spread the photos of the suspects on the table and began to connect them with threads, trying to visualize the connections between them. Philippe Moreau, who had lied about the time of his return home. What had he done during the hours he'd kept silent? Could he have found out about his wife's infidelity and decided to take revenge? Clara Dupont, whose background was in art forgery. Could she have been involved in some criminal scheme with Sophie? And why did she touch the victim's diary? Alexander Moreau, whose alibi fell apart like a house of cards. Where did he really go after his argument with Clara? And did he know about his mother's affair? François Lemaire, who admitted to a close relationship with Sophie but denied a romantic liaison. What project were they discussing? And why had he lied about his whereabouts on the night of the murder? Bernard sensed that all these details were somehow connected, but he couldn't grasp the big picture yet. He realized that he needed to dig deeper, perhaps examine the financial records of Philippe and Francois's company, as well as more thoroughly investigate Clara's past in the art world. The detective also decided that a re-examination of the crime scene was necessary. Perhaps there were some clues left there that they missed the first time around, focusing on the more obvious details. Detective Luc Bernard was sitting in his office, going through the paperwork on the Sophie Moreau case, when there was a knock on the door. A pale and worried Clara Dupont stood on the threshold. Her eyes were red with tears and her hands were visibly shaking. Clara began her story, and with each word Bernard's face grew more and more gloomy. It turned out that behind the facade of the prosperous Moreau family lurked a shocking secret. Clara confessed that for several months had been in a romantic relationship with Philippe Moreau, the father of her boyfriend Alexander. Their connection began by chance, at one of the family dinners, and quickly escalated into a passionate but destructive affair. Clara was torn between her feelings for Philippe and her remorse for Alexander. She tried to end the relationship several times, but Philippe always found a way to win her back. On the night of the murder, Clara did leave after her quarrel with Alexander, but not for a walk. She went to a secret meeting with Philippe in his office. There she informed him of her final decision to end their relationship and tell Alexander everything. Philip flew into a rage. He threatened to ruin her life if she dared to tell the truth. In the heat of the argument, he blurted out a scheme that Sophie was involved in that could destroy their family and business. A frightened Clara fled the office, but she was tormented by curiosity and fear for Alexander. She decided to follow Philippe and saw him limping into his house late at night. The next morning, she learned of Sophie's death. Fear and guilt had kept her silent about everything she knew. But now, unable to bear the burden of this terrible secret any longer, she decided to tell the truth. Bernard listened carefully to Clara's confession, feeling the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He immediately organized a search of Philippe's company office, where documents were found proving his involvement in a scheme to launder money through the sale of counterfeit works of art. Sophie, as it turned out, was also involved in this criminal activity. The detective called Philip in for questioning, where he confronted him with all the evidence he had gathered. Cornered, Philip finally broke down and confessed to his wife's murder. That fateful night, returning home after a quarrel with Clara, Philip found out that Sophie found out about his affair with their son's girlfriend. A furious argument broke out between the couple. Sophie threatened not only to reveal the truth about the affair, but also to turn over information about their illicit activities to the police. In a fit of rage, Philip strangled his wife. After realizing what he had done, he tried to fake her death as an accident or suicide. This is why he lied about the time of his return and created a false alibi for himself. After Clara Dupont's confession, events moved swiftly. Detective Luc Bernard personally led the operation to arrest Philippe Moreau. Early in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate the streets of Lyon, a police squad surrounded the Moreau mansion. Philippe seemed to be awaiting their arrival. When Bernard read him his license, not a muscle on the former businessman's face quivered. Only in his eyes was a mixture of fatigue and relief, as if the weight of the hidden secret had finally lifted from his shoulders. The news of Philippe Moreau's arrest spread instantly through the city. Journalists laid siege to the police station, trying to get a morsel of information. The story of a murder mixed with passion, betrayal, and financial fraud became a national sensation. The preliminary hearing began a week after the arrest. The courtroom was packed. Philip, dressed in a strict suit, looked pale and drained. Sitting next to him was his lawyer, known for his ability to win seemingly hopeless cases. The prosecutor had presented the court with compelling evidence of Philip's guilt. Surveillance footage, financial documents, witness testimony. Everything pointed to his involvement not only in the murder of his wife, but also in a large-scale money laundering scheme. A key moment in the trial was the testimony of Clara Dupont. Her appearance in the courtroom caused a flurry of emotions. Alexander Moreau, sitting in the front row, turned away, unable to look at the girl he once loved. Clara, in a trembling voice, told of her affair with Philippe and the events of that fateful night. The defense tried to portray Philip as a victim of circumstance, a man driven to despair by his wife's infidelity and the threat of exposure. However, the jury was not convinced. After 3 weeks of intense hearings, the court reached a verdict. Philippe Moreau was found guilty of first-degree murder and financial crimes. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. As the sentence was read, Philippe stood motionless, staring straight ahead. Only for a moment did his gaze meet his son's. In that brief moment, it was as if a spark of understanding and farewell had passed between them. Clara Dupont, despite cooperating with the investigation, also received a prison sentence for complicity in financial crimes. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole. After the trial ended, Detective Bernard watched Philippe being led away from the courtroom. The case had changed the way he looked at his job and human nature in general. He realized that the facade of respectability often hides the darkest secrets, and that passion and greed can push even those who seem to be paragons of integrity into crime. As Bernard left the courthouse, he encountered a crowd of journalists. Their questions merged into one general buzz, but the detective only shook his head and walked on by. He knew that this story would be discussed in the press and in society for a long time to come. But for him, the case was closed. Justice had been served, although the price had been incredibly high for all involved in this tragedy. A month after the completion of the case, the detective received a letter from Alexander Moreau. The young man wrote that despite all the pain and disappointment, he was grateful to Bernard for revealing the truth. He decided to sell his father's company and use the proceeds to create a foundation to help victims of domestic violence and support young artists to confront crime in the art world. The letter was a small ray of hope for Bernard. Perhaps, he thought, even from the darkest story, something good could be born. Closing Sophie Moreau's file for the last time, Bernard knew he would never forget this story of a fateful relationship that began as a forbidden romance and ended in a tragedy that changed the lives of all involved forever.